I think we probably
Shall we
can,
begin?
yeah, we can get started.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another session of Talking Films Online. This is the second Saturday of our ongoing French Film Festival, and we have Abhijeet Ranadive, who has curated this festival and has also been leading the discussion. Today, he will discuss the film ENTRE. Most of us have met him before, but I think it will be a pleasure to introduce him once again. Abhijit teaches and writes about cinema, visual arts, media, and technology. His writings are published in mainstream Marathi newspapers and periodicals. He also works as creative head and member of the selection committee at the Pune International Film Festival. He has edited an art historical biography of the painter V.S. Gaitonde and selected writings of the painter Prabhakar Parve. He has translated L'étranger by Albert Camus from French to Marathi and The Creative Circuit, a collection of essays by the noted painter and theoretician K.G. Subramaniam from English to Marathi. Welcome, Abhijit, and we look forward to the discussion.
Thanks and welcome everyone. I hope everyone has seen the film. Um, so before we start talking about the film as such, we need to take a little bit of history lesson. Simply because there's a lot going on in that classroom, and it has a lot of references to France's past. And so I thought maybe we would spend a few minutes in just going through a little bit of uh, how the French language as well as the schooling system, a little bit of that. So, as some of you might know, French wasn't the official language of France for a large part of France's history. And if you go back, then it is in 1539 when French was made the administrative language. So even then, it wasn't the official language. So it's interesting to note there that before that, Latin was used, of course, by the clergy for religious texts, but also for administration. And so in 1539, they made French the official administrative language, so that saying that legal decrees had to be made in French and written in French and so on. So the idea was this was a, you can say, the beginning of nation building in a way, and they wanted a centralized state in which there was some kind of linguistic unification, and of course ideological also, because the language is connected to ideology essentially. And we have to realize that at that time, the French as we know it was not the language even spoken by the French. So there were large parts of France that spoke different dialects, of course, as they call the patois in French. But there were also regions where no French was spoken. So, for example, the region of Brittany, or Bretagne as they call it, so it had its own language called Breton. And the Basque country, for example, which is on the border with Spain, so they spoke Basque. Um, and so there was this. The picture is not very unlike, say, India. Of course, not with that much regional differences in terms of language, but still different people did speak different languages. Then in 1635, the French Academy, or the Académie Française, was established, and it was its duty or the authority also to decide on vocabulary and grammar and usage of the French language and what is to be said officially. And that continues even today. So even during the pandemic, for example, a lot of English words are coming because of the technology and the science and the vaccines and the virus and this and that. So the French Academy publishes that no, we shouldn't use this English word, but if you want to use a French word for this concept, then this is the word that should be used, and so on. So it's very much alive and kicking, and it keeps deciding what is the standard French usage and vocabulary and so on. And then, of course, in 1789, the French Revolution happened. It's also interesting to note that initially the revolutionaries, when they said liberty, equality, fraternity, they also gave liberty of language to the citizens, which meant that every citizen was free to use whatever he preferred as uh, language, as his mother tongue or whatever. Um, and soon enough, people realized that there was a problem in governing the country and keeping the country together because, according to some statistics published at that time, only 3 million of its 25 million inhabitants at that time spoke what is known as the standard or the Parisian French. So, this kind of a concept is also similar or familiar to us. uh, I mean, I don't know about other regional languages, but in Maharashtra, for example, what is known as the standard Marathi language is what is spoken by the Brahmins of Pune. And so, there are lots of, it's a very contentious issue as to what is standard usage and all kinds of things. And so, essentially, the Parisians were trying to do the same thing, that they were saying that their French or the French that they spoke should become the standard, and eventually it did become the standard. So in 1794, French became the official or the only language of the state for all official business. And eventually, even the school system changed, and the French Republic, as its efforts to modernize the country, and of course to increase literacy and so on, it made free compulsory education in the 1900s, I think 1880s. Um, and then the only language of instruction allowed in primary school was French. And not just that, if somebody even spoke on the playground or in the schoolyard, if somebody spoke any other language, they were penalized for that. So it was regarded as a transgression. So, school and its premises have to be French speaking. That is, I mean, according to the law. Um, and then, of course, the all the minority linguistic or ethnic groups that were in France even at that time, so their rights were, you can say, not respected for their language and so on. And essentially, the other concept that became important was what is known as laïcité in French, or what we call as secularism. But the concept of secularism is also kind of different from what we are used to. In India, secularism means that we respect all religions and they're all treated equally and so on. Whereas the French concept of secularism means that the church and the state are separated, and the state cannot recognize any religion. And so the state has to be without religion, essentially. And because schooling or the education system is a part of state's authority, then the schools have to be laik or secular, and which means all kinds of things like I mean, even in recent years, there have been problems. I don't know if any of you have followed the recent history of French schools, where, for example, all kinds of religious symbols, external religious symbols, were banned in schools. And I mean, it becomes important because, for example, in the film, when we see Suleiman, I think. Um, he shows this tattoo which is a verse from Quran. So I mean, it's a very serious issue to even display such a tattoo in class, so all kinds of controversies arose because of that. Even Punjabi Sikh students in France were prohibited from entering the schools with their turbans and so on. And Jewish people were also prohibited from wearing their caps and all kinds of things. So the school has been a very, very, very contentious place in France for a long time now. And these repercussions you see in films, not just in this film, but in French cinema on the whole. School has been a very important subject. Perhaps one of the very first films that treated school as the subject of cinema was a 1933 film called Zero de Conduite, or Zero for Conduct. Um, it's a film made on the cusp of when silent cinema was giving way to talkies, and so it's a talking film, although heavily influenced by techniques from silent cinema. And to tell you its story very briefly, it shows a residential school in which pupils are staying there within the school premises. And the school system is extremely rigid, extremely severe, extremely strict with pupils. The teachers are very severe, very strict. But not just that, the teachers are very incompetent. They are also corrupt. There are all kinds of things. There's even a pedophile teacher there. There's a teacher who steals, and then of course they are inept, and they punish students very severely for any slightest transgression or even the slightest breaking of rules. And then eventually the students become tired of all that, and they revolt. And so the film ends in chaos, and where the students have revolted against the teachers, and it's all completely chaos. The film is very interesting, very important in French history, because it was banned until 1946. So the film was made in 1933, and not just that, it was banned because it was considered anti-French. So the kind of depictions of teachers and students and the revolt and the school in general, it was considered, uh, it's almost like the way sedition is used in our country, that to say that something is anti-French is like very serious. And so the film was banned until after the Second World War, and it was the first French film to be officially banned. So now you'll understand how the moment you say school on cinema, what a contentious issue, but just by choosing the subject, the writer and the director of the film have made a choice. Um, and then there are, of course, tons of French films which show schools. Maybe some of you have seen François Truffaut's first film, which is considered an important milestone for the French New Wave, Les 400 coups, or 400 blows. So a large part of the film also happens inside the school, where it is very much in the tradition of Zero for Conduct, in the sense that the school teacher is extremely strict. He refuses to understand the point of view of the students, and the protagonist of the 400 blows is a young student, Antoine Donnel, and who's completely disgusted and disappointed with the school system, and eventually he revolts against his parents and his school and everything. So society, you can say. um, so that is in a way the background for um, entre les murs, or the class as it is known in English. um, and then the history of this film also is very interesting. It is based on a book, although it is not a strict adaptation of the book. So what is interesting is that the book was written by a French teacher, François Bégodeau, and it is based on his experiences in his school, and the book was a bestseller. And François Bégodeau is the person you see on screen enacting the teacher François Marin, in the film. So the writer of the book, the original book on which the film is based, is the teacher in this film, whom you see on screen. So in a way, he's depicting his own life role on screen there when you see him there. And the film was conceived not as a strict adaptation. What they tried to do was, they got the ideas of what this teacher was trying to do in his class, and they tried to enact them in real life situations. So they got volunteers who were school to students who were, as you can guess, most of these, in fact all of the students are non actors, and so they were chosen as real students from that age group. And they conducted, the filmmaker, the director, and the screenwriter, who is, one of the three screenwriters is the teacher himself, François Bigoudou. So they conducted extensive workshops for these children, and in which, the kind of situations that you see on screen in the film, they were kind of enacted in the workshops. And what they tried to do was, they tried to gauge the personality of each child who took part in the workshop. There were, I think there were about 50 students in the workshop. And from these students and from what happened in these workshops, they wrote the scenario of the film, and they chose a few students um, for the kind of temperaments or the kind of personalities that they had. So essentially you can say that what you see on screen is these students enacting their own life or their own personalities. So it's very interesting. I wish some of the non-French speakers were able to understand. There are some videos available of these students, when they, after the film was released, they had press conferences and events related to the release of the film, where you see some of these students and you see them speak and you see them behave in front of the camera, and you realize that they're very much like what you see on screen in the film. And so that is what these people have done. And of course, needless to say, the scenario of the film is constructed, although they have based it on things that happened in the workshop and so on. So, for example, the some of the important events like, Suleiman and he's getting evicted from the school and so on. So those are of course constructed parts of the scenario, or even the fact that this girl Esmeralda, I think at the end she says that I have read Plato's Republic, which was assigned to my sister, and I just read it out of interest and so on. So these are very much parts of the constructed scenario, as you can guess. But there's a very interesting statement made by this director, and I'll read it out to you. He says, "I didn't want to make a version of Dead Poet Society." This is Laurent Conte, the director, uh, which is Dead Poet Society, a film where the teacher is brilliant and heroic and he knows everything. I wanted to show a school in all its complexity, where the students don't always learn and the teachers are not always sure of what they're doing. So you realize when you watch the film that that is what he has done, that the teacher is not a know-all person. He has obvious faults, and the students have, of course, a lot of faults as well. Um, what is also interesting is, so given this history of what I told you about Zero de Conduite or Le Quai Sanku, etc. We need to also take a slight detour in French history again, and turn to the events of what is known as May 1968. So some of you might know that 1968 was a very interesting year in European as well as American history, where there were anti-Vietnam War protests in the US, and in France, what is known as the student revolt, but which wasn't just the students revolting, there were also workers revolting and so on. Um, So these events of May 68, as they some people call it a revolution, some people just call it les événements, or the events. And so there's a contentious issue as regards to even what the effects of what happened in May 1968 were. But what we can say for sure is that amongst many things that changed in France after 68, the school system or the education system was one of the most important things to change. And so this whole rigidity of the school system uh, slowly gave way to a more open system, which gave more space to the students, because that was one of the demands of the students of May 1968. And so the schooling system became more open to students, and the teachers were expected to give more space to students and so on. And you see a reflection of that in what the teacher in the classroom is doing. Um, Moreover, I think the other contentious issue that is very much there in the classroom in the film is that slowly the demographics of France was changing. And again, so if you look at colonial history, at the colonial history of France, just like Britain, France also had its colonies, mostly in Northern Africa, but also in what today we know as Vietnam and Cambodia and so on. Um, and again, there are some very important differences in the way the French regarded their colonies and the way the British regarded their colonies. I mean, sure, the British did a lot of nasty things, as we know from our own history. However, the French were very possessive about their colonies. I mean, they committed a lot of atrocities, and in a way, sometimes our French teachers used to say that, no matter what, you guys should consider yourselves lucky that we weren't your colonizers, because the French treated their colonies much more atrociously than the British did. And I think there's a grain of truth in that. But not just that, the French were not even willing to give them independence for a long time. So, Algeria, for example, if you look at the history of the Algerian War and how they had to fight for independence, so there were a lot of I mean, of course, there was war, and there was a lot of censorship in France as to what the French army and what the French government was doing inside Algeria, and how the Algerian people was suffering. And I mean, even a liberal or very combative writer like Albert Camus, for example, who was an Algerian. I mean, he was a French of Algerian descent. Um, so even he was of the opinion for a long period that Algeria should not be independent, but should be a part of France, but they should be given more liberties and so on. So the Algerians, even today, they hold Camus responsible for those opinions, and there are many Algerians who are angry at Camus for that, and so on. So this, all this, um, slowly came to the fore as an important issue as more and more immigrants came to France and changing the demographics of France. So today we have a situation where I think, in terms of the number of the racist or ethnographic composition of France, if you compare that with other European countries, I think, I don't know the exact statistics, but I think France has the largest number of minorities as a percentage of population compared to all the other European countries. And so there's a sizable portion of the population which comes from the former colonies of France. And because of all these policies that we talked about, the laïcité and the way the French treat their education system, and the concept of a French citizen, and what the education system should strive to make its citizens. So the way they try to do that is that, instead of treating them as a melting pot where everyone comes with their own culture, and they're free to practice their own culture and still remain a citizen of France. They try to impose a certain uniformity with the language, with their concept of secularism, and in general. So even when a person becomes a French citizen, when you take the oath of citizenship, and if you go and Google it, you'll find lots of articles written by people about what all you have to swear to when you become a French citizen, naturalized citizen, and so on. So there are a lot of things that you have to swear to in terms of that I will remain secular, and that I will do this and I will do that, and how I will strive to become a part of a worthy citizen of the French Republic, and so on. And essentially what it boils down to is that you have to give away your culture to accept what is the supposedly French culture, which is essentially um, the culture derived from what the predominantly white and Catholic, older, or the more French citizens of France call its culture. And all these issues come to the fore, as you can see in the film. So I think we are running out of time for me saying what I have to say. But uh, I mean, this is one film where I don't know what happens to the person who can't understand the French dialogue, because no matter how well the translation of the dialogue into English subtitles, no matter how well it is done, and I think in the version that I shared, the subtitling is done quite competently. Still, there are lots of issues that are just untranslatable. Like very often, the students are speaking a language. I mean, they're speaking French, of course, but they use certain words which are used by the um, I mean, is the street French, as you call them, or the kind of French that is spoken by the poorer and the immigrants in France, and they use a lot of words. And you will find situations where Francois, the teacher, asks them, "What was that word that you used just now? What does it mean?" And so, in a way, he's teaching them French, but he's learning French from them also. And you'll realize how contentious that is, because um, he is supposed to teach them only standard French, and the French that they are speaking, in a way that is denied them by the schooling system. And the standard Parisian French has to be rote learned by them. And then on the other side, from the student side, for example, they ask these questions like, regarding the l'imparfait du subjunctive, which is the imperative of the subjunctive. So the French language has these tenses, and so these tenses are used only in literature. They are not used in spoken French, or nobody uses them. And like the students say, if we start speaking this kind of French at home, people will laugh at us. And that is how it's is true for most people. I mean, even white Catholics, the French people, they don't speak that kind of language at home. And it's if at all, when the teacher says that, yeah, but I mean, with my friends, just yesterday I used this construction, or this tense, and they say, yeah, but that is bourgeois. And so you see, in a way, the students are revolutionary, and they are poking fun at the bourgeois values, which they which they openly recognize as bourgeois, and they taunt the teacher as being bourgeois, with a part of the bourgeoisie with the bourgeois values, and so on. So these are very contentious issues, and they're contentious to the extent where, um, as you know, for example, in the last few years, France has seen, of course, riots on the streets by the immigrants. saying that the country is not fair to us. We don't get justice, and there are police atrocities, of course, and all kinds of things. But on the whole, they keep complaining that the system is completely turned against us. And not just riots, of course, there have been terrorist attacks, and I'm sure you've heard the Charlie Hebdo attack and so on. And the more recent thing that happened last year was, it's kind of related to what we are seeing in the classroom here, is that there was a teacher called Samuel Paty, who, when he was discussing the French Republican concept of freedom of expression, he said that I'm now going to show you shocking images, and so if you are religiously sensitive, you're free to leave the class and so on. So he said that beforehand. But then he went on to show images of the cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad, which were published by Charlie Hebdo, and because of which, as you might know, the office of Charlie Hebdo was attacked, and killing the journalists and the cartoonists and so on. So he showed those images in class, and some students complained, and they made this information. They shared it with other people, and eventually the teacher was uh, beheaded and killed. And so the whole country was in shock when the teacher was killed. And there's this whole debate of, what does secularism mean, what does freedom of expression mean, what do republican values mean, and what are we going to do to the schooling system? Does it need to change, or should we respect our republican heritage and continue to teach what we've been teaching, and try to make French citizens of the French Republic. Uh, I mean, try to make our students true citizens according to our concepts of citizens of the French Republic. So yes, so these are. I mean, of course, the film was made before even the Charlie Hebdo attack. So these issues were not. They were very much there, but things hadn't reached that level of severity at that time. But in that sense, you can say that the film is prescient, and so I regard that as a very important film in the contemporary French history. So yes, that's about what I had to say, and I think we can start the discussion now.
Thank you very much, Abhijeet, especially for the historical background that you laid out right at the beginning of your analysis of the film. Uh, it's now open for discussion.
And of course, I would very much like to hear from each of you. Uh, how do you compare the teacher and the student? I mean, if on your level or on your standard benchmark of good to evil, how good and how evil is the teacher, and how good or bad are the students? Because the film, in a way, the film doesn't have a hero or a villain as such, but the film does portray both of them not in very complimentary light. I must say.
Would anyone like to begin the discussion?
Yeah,
Yeah,
Nihal, yeah,
Nandini.
yeah, yeah. Actually, thanks, Abhijit. Actually, Abhijit has said everything that has to be said about the film, I guess. So there's not much to
Absolutely.
really say, except that I actually teach. I use this film in my teaching. Huh. When I teach sociology and social anthropology of education, actually,
Okay,
interestingly,
very
it's a film
interesting.
too. Yeah, and it's very interesting because of this thing that you're talking about, what you ended with, this question that you posed to us about how do we look at the teacher and the student. And it's actually very interesting because we tend to see education in such normative terms, that we don't really allow for contestation within classrooms.
Right.
So to me, actually, this question that you're raising actually isn't a question for us, because when we are actually looking at classrooms, or this kind of the kinds of issues that the film brings up in terms of power and language and identity and race and class, we're not actually moved already beyond the normative frame. So it's not even, it's not there. And a lot of films from, of course, like you were saying, Zero for Conduct, and but even to a film like To Serve with Love, for example. And it's
Mm.
interesting to see this film with To Serve with Love, which we've also done in our classes.
Okay.
Because yeah, it's a very different kind of film, and there's a redemption narrative in that one, right? So the black man actually is redeemed, but here that
There is
doesn't
no.
happen, and I think that it
Yeah.
doesn't happen at all. And in fact, that's what makes it really interesting, because it's so real. The like exactly what you said. I mean, he's going in there to teach French, but he's ending up learning French, and the colonies have come home. And what is really interesting in that film, I found, is that it's when football comes up that they all suddenly are participating in the classroom, right? Because they're all football mad nation. I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
come from those backgrounds. So that's a very interesting turn in the film, that here's this man, he's trying to impose this standard French, and he's getting resisted. And then when the question of football comes up, they're all Mali and Cameroon, and I mean they're all sort of Senegal, and sort of claiming their own thing. So that's very interesting. So that's one thing. And the other is the name of the film itself, and the way in which it was translated into the class.
Yeah.
I don't know what do you have to say about Entre les Mots, because it's what does that actually mean? And we've had lots of discussions around what does this actually mean, and
Yeah.
why was it
So
translated in English as the class? But really nice. Thank you for that. It was so nice to hear
I'm
you.
happy to hear that. Yeah, so Entre les Murs, the literal translation of the French, and this is the name of the original book on which the film is based. It means between the walls, and as it is, the walls are physical in the sense that most of the film happens between those walls, and then the walls are also, of course, metaphorical, because um, it's a very interesting situation, because the French Republic, which is funding the teacher, the teacher, it's a government funded school, it's a public school. So the teacher is an employee of the French Republic, and so he is there, paid by the French Republic, to put republican values in his students. And so, it is his duty to bring his students outside the walls of whatever they are living in, and to introduce them to the bigger world. But in a way, even the teacher has his own walls to contend with. And so, in a way, it's a what you call a parkour in French. I don't know how to translate it in. I guess it's a journey for both the teacher as well as the students. So what happens during that one academic year is a journey for both the teacher and as well as the students, where it's a journey, hopefully, of coming outside the walls.
Yeah. Anyone else?
And what do you say about the translation? It kind of takes away all this politics of
Yeah,
money.
I mean, I'm sorry to say this, but uh, even even these kinds of films, they are subject to marketing decisions. And so when a foreign language film has to be marketed to an English speaking audience, it's mostly the large studios from Hollywood and other places which make these decisions. So for example, this film won the award in the Cannes Film Festival. And Cannes, it's, apart from being the most prestigious film festival in the world, it's also the biggest film market. And so, as soon as a film wins an award in Cannes, it is heavily there's a heavy competition for grabbing the film rights across different countries and so on. And so it's very much a commercial decision. And my guess is the studio that bought it for American and British and distribution to other English speaking countries must have some of one of those studios must have made that decision. I don't know. It's a very flat title. I hate the English title, I must say.
Well, it is the contemporary class in many European cities today.
But then we must realize that it's also a play of words, and I'm happy that they managed that in the sense that uh, it is not just the classroom class, but the students and the teachers. There's a class gap between the two.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
he's very much a part of the bourgeoisie, and they are very much from the working classes. It is a working class neighborhood when they say the 20th arrondissement of Paris, and which you see the reflection of that in the classroom's composition.
That's right.
Okay. Anyone else would like to step in at this point? Yeah, Tarkeshwar, please come.
Yeah. Uh, the subsuming uh, the differences within the classroom among the students uh, under the category class would be highly problematic. So, because it's racial, religious, there are so many angles to it. So, the
Yes,
diversity in the classroom
yes,
is much more than just the class difference. So,
yes,
we have to be careful about that particular thing.
yes,
Uh, See, this the diversity in the classroom is not matched by the diversity in the staff room. There is a conflict. So
yes,
it's more homogeneous. The staff room is more homogeneous, and the classroom is more heterogeneous. So that is the
right,
clash of subjectivities that is happening. So as a teacher, I come with a particular subjectivity to the classroom, and the students come with different subjectivities, and there
right,
is a negotiation that is happening there. And
right,
some of these negotiation between these two uh, sets of subjectivities also become violent, as you
yes,
see in the film.
yes,
But how it gets resolved, that we don't know in the narrative, because we have not yet resolved it
yes. In
outside
fact,
the classroom. Because classroom is a reflection of what is happening outside the classroom too. We formulated this kind of uh, a kind of framework to understand what is happening in the Indian colleges, especially in the English classroom. So in 90s, uh, many of our teachers teaching in elite universities, in JNU, University of Hyderabad, even in NIFLU, they were talking about the crisis in English. For them, the crisis in English studies was more to do with English being a colonial language. But then we argued that the crisis is not about English being a colonial language, but the classroom becoming heterogeneous, students coming from different backgrounds, and the teachers belong to a particular background. So there is a clash between these two subjectivities, and that's the main uh, clash. So the the film, using class as a kind of pretext, tries to summarize, as you said, uh, this kind of influx of different race, religious minorities in the context of globalization, and also earlier in the context of colonialism. There is a link between this, the colonial and then the global. So something else is happening in the metropolitan cities. So it is becoming more multicultural, if I have to use a kind of more less political term than heterogeneous. So it's a multicultural classroom. So how do we address this multicultural classroom is something that we all debate.
yes,
But it is not simply multicultural. The subjectivities are different. And unless we make the staff room more heterogeneous, and we also find ways to negotiate with uh, different sets of expectations from the students. So there is a completely what you expect them to learn and what they want to learn. There's a clash between the two.
right,
And what they are learning and how you assess that there's a clash. So unless we seriously think about what we are expecting them to learn, and the tools of teaching too, tools of evaluation, unless there's a critical thinking about all these aspects, uh, we will not be able to solve this within these walls,
Right.
unless the
Right.
walls are broken, again metaphorically. But outside the walls, outside the society, how are we going to negotiate it? Is what we are seeing a kind of backlash position that existed, white Catholic subjectivity, or in Indian context, a dominant upper caste Hindu male subjectivity. So there's a backlash that is happening now. So uh, the homogeneous classroom is giving way to, from quote unquote earlier secularist position to this new position to deal with these kind of differences. So I don't know whether that is a solution, or that is also a problem. How we are dealing with it.
Yeah.
Thank you for asking us to look at this film and
Thanks.
introducing the film for us.
Thanks. In continuation with what you've been saying, um, again, there is one thing that I hope people noticed, which is that uh, the politics in the staff room, if you see, for example, what people have to say about Suleiman, etc., uh, you realize that in the staff room, Francois, the teacher whom you see in the film as a protagonist, um, he's very much on the side of the students, and in a way he even tries to um, prevent Suleiman from getting evicted from the school. So in a way he's fighting his own battles in the staff room with the other teachers and with the principal and so on, and he's fighting his own battles inside the classroom, as very well documented. On the other hand, there are also some very contentious things that even the students say. For example, the discussion that happens around his homosexuality. It's very interesting because the students don't say it specifically, but the way they treat the subject can be said to be homophobic. There's also one particular place where, again, I don't know how it came across as translation in the English subtitles, but one of the students, when they're talking about, oh, we don't use this kind of language in our classroom and in our homes and so on, and the student, I think, is describing an incident where he had gone to a party where all these people in their ties, etc., were there, and they were looking at him dressed in his sneakers or tracks or something, t-shirt and something. He's saying, so he mentions the word. So these were the Jew kind of, I mean, these were the kind of people looking, they're looking like Jews or something. So he says something like that. I don't remember the exact dialogue, but so there is anti-Semitism also there. You realize that in class. It's a very, very, very interestingly constructed narrative what they have in the film, and so the whole thing is you cannot it becomes it's made it it's made such that it becomes very difficult to take sides. So the students have their side, but then they have their blind spots also, and the teachers have their side and they have their own blind spots also, and everybody has to fight with that and with each other. Um, so that is, so there's so many things left unsaid, or it just something comes in just one piece of dialogue and then it vanishes, and before you notice it, it's gone. So the film is very interestingly constructed in that sense.
Like, as you said, this particular teacher is trying to engage with students, And students are also like this teacher very much.
Yes.
Because they are into negotiation, there is some tension.
Yes.
And the tension is more pronounced between this teacher and this group of students than with other teachers. So in that sense, the negotiation is on, though the negotiation, as I said, might have given rise to certain kind of friction
Yes.
and also some to some extent violence. But there is negotiation is going on between these two.
Right.
But
Right.
the problem is when it goes back to the staff room, there he becomes part of that group. So again, it becomes a kind of clash between the two.
Yes. Quite so.
Uh, this is Shashi here. Can I add something?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. So my understanding about the film is on one aspect. While watching, I realized that it is showing that the content and syllabus or curriculum is kind of meaningless and very um, loosely constructed, and it is not connecting to what the students want to learn, and teacher is struggling to throw those concepts, words, and knowledge to students. And particularly in the end of the film, when this Francois is kind of summing up their 9 months stay in the classroom, that what all you learned, and at the different students are narrating their own summing up takeaway. So this last girl comes and says that I have learned nothing. So that was the very chilling moment for me, that the entire time and entire system of the schooling ends in, I mean, very absurd thing. I mean, you don't take quite meaningful learning, and apart from those cultural and political issues that this film raises, my main you can say takeaway is that the education at the end of the session that a student gets is very very disconnected, and I mean they are also at loss what they all learned actually.
Yes and no. I will say one thing specifically here, and which is related to, for example, what we were saying earlier about the teaching of English in India. That these students, no matter what they do with their professional life or their life in general, in the future, the kind of standard French that he is trying to teach them is extremely important for their future, no matter what. And especially in that initial scene when they have listed which words did you not understand from this text, and if you look at the words that they have listed, and if you consider the fact that these students are 14 15 years old, and even at that age, after having gone through primary school and secondary school, the kind of words that they don't understand, um, it is life is going to be very difficult for them uh, in future when they actually start working. And so in a way, he's trying to go out of his way to teach them that French, which is very relevant and very important to them for their future life. And at some point or another, they will have to realize that. I mean, it's a sad fact of life that if they are looking for upward mobility, they will have to have a certain proficiency in French. And which is why I say that, uh, is that situation a bad situation to have? I don't know. I can't be the judge on that, honestly.
Okay, anyone else has anything to?
Yeah, can I come in
Yeah,
again if you don't mind?
yeah.
If no one else. This question that is being raised about, what does one expect from schooling of these kids who are marginalized by race and religion and class and location within the city as well, because they live also in segregated, ghettoized areas, and this is also common to communities. But the thing is that the expectation also that schools will teach them standardized, standard French or bourgeois French or whatever, to be able to cope within employment is a bit of a myth also that is thrown at such communities. And in fact, it is the French theorists who have actually told us this the most.
Yes.
So that's also quite interesting. And
I was hoping somebody would say that.
yes, and they are the ones who have actually made those connections between, and that too, not even really looking at questions like this, like not looking at questions of religion or identity in the way in which this film probes identity, right? They were, if you think of Bourdieu, he was not talking about race as much. If Kant talked a bit, he did talk about race and so on, but otherwise, Bourdieu didn't. But what he was talking about was also the structures of mobility within France. And it's a bit of a myth. And I think that when one sees this film, one is reminded, at least I was quite reminded of the season on education in The Wire.
Yes.
Yes, because it is, we have made our silly slumdog millionaires, but the thing is, these dimensions have not been probed in our context enough, and this film does that. It's deeply troubling, actually. And when you see what happens after Entre les Murs with the Charlie Hebdo and then this Samuel Paty, I mean, it gets more and more disturbing. And in a sense, also intractable. And while all this is becoming intractable, the schools all over the world with such communities are talking about disciplining them into the normative sort of thing, and with the same expectations that, So yes, it is contradictory. It's very troubling, because we do know that where is the mobility for these kids? I mean, even older Algerian communities have not had that kind of mobility, even though they are much more present, but they're not as present as those who've come in later.
Right.
So it's very troubling, and I think the film really brings that out. And Francois' own, why should we expect the children will not be homophobic or anti-Semitic? They will be. I mean, there's, the question is in a complex, we can't even compare it to India at some level, I feel, because I mean, those societies are so racist, and with their colonial histories, the antagonisms that exist are so overt and becoming so much more on the surface, that it's a very disturbing kind, especially his killing last year was extremely disturbing. A whole lot of young people who are just doing this, and I mean, how does one sort of react to it? I don't know, frankly.
Yes, quite so. And it's also interesting that Samuel Paty, after he taught the concept of freedom of expression to his class, I think he held a sort of a referendum in the class saying that should the images of the Prophet Muhammad be shown or not. And I think a majority of the students in the class, which included even white students or Christian students and so on, because for him it was a mixed class. So majority of the students actually decided that no, freedom of expression should not include that, and which to the French, even to the French average person, I would say, it was a very shocking conclusion. That to know that not just to know that a teacher can be killed for teaching this, but also that the class can even go in that direction where um, instead of being taught the supposedly republican values of the freedom of expression, the class is turning away from the freedom of expression.
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah. And anyone else? Nikhil, may I take the liberty of asking you to step in with your experience of teaching in schools?
Okay. Uh, Actually, when I watched the movie, it was long back. I think 6, 7 years before, or I don't remember exact time I watched it. So uh, I thought that um, it was portraying the sad state of the education field. Overall, nobody bothers about what we are learning in school because professionally it doesn't matter. The teachers, especially this teacher, I thought didn't come from the background where he aspired to be a teacher. He just, I mean, most of the films related to schooling that I watched, uh, like there is a movie in which the hero from the movie Piano has played a teacher's role, and then there is a student, a girl student in his class, so he becomes connected with her like a father figure or something. So all those films from Hollywood and France. There was also that movie um, where sexual offenses sexual offenses against children were treated in a very minute way. So there is a department in the French police which looks after this particular area,
Yes,
and
you're
then
talking about the film Police by Maiven.
yes, so it all made me so sad. Saying, I mean, thinking as a teacher, um, feeling that it's not only there in school, but then when I taught at university, I realized that the children had learned nothing in school. And what we taught them, I mean, quite recently, I had an idea of, all of us becoming whistleblowers at our own institutes because there is so much of um nonsense going on. Nobody bothers about teaching anything because either they don't know or they don't care, or the children have no interest whatsoever in that. So if we look at all this system and then look at the movie, I felt that it was also trying to portray a very bleak picture, which is very realistic, especially in the urban India and everywhere in the West. That education has become redundant. The way we have been administering it, or we have been imparting it to children. So maybe we need a complete overhaul of the situation. And maybe, I mean, that was what my impression was.
I have to say that uh, perhaps the film is not as bleak, and you don't have to be depressed by watching the film. The reason I'm saying that is that you see, no matter what, the teacher Francois in this film, he has a very you can say combative or even how do you call it, unorthodox way of dealing with the students. And you realize this when you kind of guess this when you hear what the other teachers have to say. I mean, one of the most hopeful moments in the film comes in this incident of the self portrait, that he's a student of English, and so in his class the self portrait is essentially the students writing words, meaning using words to write an essay about themselves. But a student like Suleiman, who is not good at writing and who's not good with words, he comes up with these photos. And how the teacher encourages him to um, actually create a self portrait using those photographs, and how he in fact lauds him, how he in fact praises him to the rest of the class, saying that look at what he has done. He's done something very different from you, and I think that's quite nice. So you have to realize that the film is constructed in a certain way. So the fact that Suleiman eventually gets removed from the school and so on, So that is a part of this film's construction. But incidents like the what happens to Suleiman when motivated, I think those are the kind of aspects of the film that I would say don't make the film as bleak as perhaps you think it is. The other aspect that I would point to is that no matter what, because of his unconventional or in a way combative teaching methods, he makes the students speak, he makes the students talk, and in his class the students are comfortable speaking even against the teacher, or even teasing him, or even saying things offensive to him. And we have to give him credit that it is thanks to him that classroom has become such a lively place where they are discussing language and many other things. And in a way he's making the students think, in a way he's making the students think that there is a place for them in that classroom. And so, Suleiman or Henriette, who's the student that says who says at the end of the class that I haven't learned anything. So they are at one extreme, but then there are a lot of other pupils who are in between, and of course there are some bright students as well in the class. So I mean, I would say that the film also tries to say that all is not lost.
Oh yes, of course. I loved the film. I loved the way the hero is sensitive, and I could understand because all the things that he has portrayed there. As I mean, I didn't know that he was also the author of a book, and then the screenplay was adapted from it, and he was there as a part of the team. So I realized at least one thing, that the person who was making the film had been a teacher, because there are so many small things that they portray so well. And then the time when he is so vulnerable when children comment on his sexuality. And I have had colleagues who were commented on their caste in a classroom. I mean, a primary student asks his teacher or her teacher about their caste. I have seen this happen, so I know how vulnerable school teachers get. And then but then I
So
was talking about,
sorry to
yes please.
interrupt you, but so where was this, if I may ask?
This was in UP, I think, when I was there in UP. So I used to listen to conversations from people, and then they would casually refer to people's castes. And
You mean
then,
students would?
yes. So students would just ask casually the caste of the teacher. And then it was so shocking for me. Like, um, I just couldn't believe that. Like, maybe to go back to this emergence of religion and caste in politics. Maybe since 1990s, it has been on the rise. But then I don't know before that, because I didn't come across any such thing, at least in the 80s and early 90s. But since the Ayodhya and all that coming into play in politics, this has grown up. And I think the religion has picked up in international world maybe out of 2001. Before that, people spoke mainly in the Western world in terms of class and not in terms of religion. So maybe after 2001, they have become more, I mean, that is what I feel, more oriented towards looking at people's religion rather than looking at their class. So
I
as
think
I was, okay, please.
no, sorry, I interrupted you. I thought you had finished
so
speaking.
so I felt that the vulnerability is captured so well, and the acting is so natural. And um, but then I mean, to come out of the movie and then looking at what he does, we all do that. in our classroom, we encourage children to say something. Now, when a person who doesn't say a word comes up with a sentence on his own, we encourage. But then at the end of the day, it's all futile. We know that. The way the teacher is described, shown there, encouraging a character, a boy, to come up with some kind of achievement. He gets that sense of achievement. But in real world, what I have seen is it doesn't get translated into any kind of success. So, looking at the movie, I just loved it. I loved the realistic picture of everything. But then, because they had to show something that was positive, that's why they showed it, I believe. Even I would write a film, I would show a scene where, something encourages a character, because they are not making a tragedy, a dark tragedy, that too. So they are trying to be also positive and negative. So keeping a balance, tapping both the sides equally. But in real world, because I have taught in school to grade 4 students when I began, then I went on to teach secondary section students, then I went on to teach higher secondary students, and then I went on to teach undergraduate students, and then I taught actual trainee teachers. So I taught for 2 years 2 classes of B.Ed students who were trying to become teachers, and they had no clue what they were doing. They didn't have a proper degree in their subject of choice. And I saw, I couldn't do anything, because as I was saying about the whistleblower thing, all teachers becoming whistleblowers, and show the hypocrisy of the education system. Like when I was in Baroda, where I met Geeta madam. So I was shocked to see that, I went to, not Baroda, Gujarat. I went to Gujarat thinking that it's one of the progressive states. But then when I realized that in the University of Baroda, the, almost 30% positions were only say filled up in on ad hoc basis, I was so depressed. I said, how can education grow in a state where they don't care for filling up empty positions when you have the people around you? So, that's something, looking at different parts of India and that education, so it makes me depressed. But as a movie, this is a wonderful movie as a way of characterizing each student, giving individuality to each character there, bringing out the vulnerability and also the strength in the teacher. And then he takes sides with the wider world when he's in the class, but then when he is in the staff room, he defends his students. So it's all I loved it as a writing, the screenplay, and then putting it into something like a realistic kind of drama on screen. I just loved that film. So when I received this this title, that this would be the debate, I was so elated. Like, this is something that we need, and the French people have been doing this. And again, when we come to India, we haven't been doing anything even close to 1% of that, and that's something makes me really sad.
Yes, quite true.
Can I say something also, since I also work in sort of an allied teaching, I teach older people, but I'm just, I really don't think it's a hopeless film. I couldn't see the hopelessness in it. It's, the thing is that it's real, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's hopeless. It just means that there's a lot that's going on outside those walls. And I think that those walls sometimes are porous, and they let in what is happening outside into the classroom, which we tend to see as very pristine and very pure and innocent, and they never are. I even if a child does actually ask or whatever, refer to a teacher's caste, I wonder why it doesn't happen more often, frankly, considering the discourses outside the walls of the school. It doesn't happen for other reasons, but in France, maybe it happens. Maybe there's a certain way in which a certain kind of secularism or a certain kind of public culture exists where the kids can actually resist in the way we see them resisting. But they have lives. They have their own subcultures, or their own cultures. Why should we call them subcultures? And they have their own ways of making do in life. So I didn't really see it as extremely bleak. It was very hard to watch. It was very difficult, but I think that it is true. I actually wanted to ask another question, and before that, I was thinking that Francois, again, another book that's very interesting. It's a book. It's not been made into a film. Is a book. It's also about a white teacher who lived all his life in a African American suburb of Boston, Roxbury, and it's a book that he wrote. He's a very popular writer, actually. He was a school teacher, Jonathan Kozol, called Savage Inequalities. And it's very similar. It's about his experiences with these kids. And it's even more difficult in the United States. There's another kind of, police brutalities on a regular basis. Anyway, so it's quite similar in that sense. I just also wanted to ask you, actually, what about the making of this? Because it's got the rawness of a documentary kind of, that those sharp cuts, those, those, and somewhere it's also constructed like that, isn't it? Like
Yes. So as I said initially, so they held these very extensive workshops with children, in which the idea was to bring out the personalities of the kids, and based on that they selected a few kids out of I think 50 children, a few that you see inside the class in the film. So they were selected based on how they were as children. So the person who is Esmeralda in the film, so she's also a very that kind of an in your face, or very how do you call it, she can be very rude in real life also. So in a way they were chosen for what they were, and then the scenes were constructed based on what happened in these workshops. So the children are in a way reenacting what happened in the workshops, and because it's based on their own personalities, it becomes very easy for them to uh, even speak those dialogues and do the kind of things that they do. And I have a feeling that some of these things happened impromptu also. And not just that, what they did was, while shooting the film, so they took every scene, every time they were shooting a scene, there were three cameras in the classroom. So one was focused on the teacher, one was focused on the students, and then the third one was kept there just for the purpose of checking extensively all the time whether there was something interesting happening inside the classroom, and which was impromptu, or which was which should be caught. And then the third camera kept catching those things, and they've included that also in the film. So it becomes that kind of
perfect.
a documentary like
Yes, we
feeling
have
that
to
you
say,
get.
yeah.
It's a combination of all these reasons.
It's really like an ethnographer's dream. I mean, you just
Right,
have
right,
those three cameras,
right.
and it comes out like it must have been quite difficult to edit, no?
Yes.
Must have been quite really tough.
So this team is very. I mean, Laurent Conte. He's made other films also, and the other person who's a part of the screenwriting team, Robin Campillo. So he went on to make this film 120 BPM, which also maybe some of you have seen, and which also won an award at Cannes, and which is about the gay rights movement at around the time when AIDS was emerging, and which is also a very interesting film. So all these three people who wrote the film, one of course is the person you see on screen, the teacher, and then the other two being the director and the co-screenwriter of the other two. So they're all in that sense very intelligent people, And so they knew, I think, what they were doing when they made the film, and it shows.
Anki, you have unmuted. Please go ahead. Anki. Okay. Yeah,
Uh,
Nikhil. Yeah, Nikhila. Please go ahead.
um, yeah, so I mean, thank you very much, Abhijit, both for suggesting the film and for that extensive background on a background which helped us to read the film. There were two, three things which were very, particularly very striking for me. One, of course, is, as Nandini also said, and I think you also mentioned that these differences are so much more stark. These different backgrounds that they come from, and the kind of they kind of enter into a space which is supposedly neutral, which obviously is not. So, what for me was very interesting about what is happening in this, both in the classroom as a space and in the school itself, is that so many of these fissures, so many of these kind of issues that are there with regard to race, religion. Um, the school, I felt, was dealing with these issues in a more forthright and head-on manner. Whether we agree with the so-called resolutions that is handed out or not, I think the kind of engagement, even of teachers who disagree with the way the students are, the grounds for their disagreement, and the level of debate that is happening even in the classroom, I thought was quite extraordinary. This sense that yes, this is a contentious issue, but the need to deal with this issue in in whatever ways, in probably non-threatening ways outside these walls. If these issues were played up, I think the outcome would be more severe. The outcome would be more violent. But in some ways, the school, even as it is setting up these walls, is also functioning as a kind of sanctuary, for these identities to play up and engage, negotiate. So there is room for engagement here. There is room for conflict, in whatever flawed way, or in whatever imperfect way. But I thought that was quite. As a teacher, this is something that was amazing to me. That some of the things that we see in classroom, or they may one may talk about it at a theoretical level, but to be able to engage with students, or even with each other, as colleagues in the staff room, I don't think we quite do it in as upfront a manner. So the level of public debate that is also seeping into the or maybe moving out of the school into the public arena, I thought was extraordinary and quite striking for me in the film. The second very interesting aspect for me in the film is what happens after this bitter resolution of the Suleiman issue happens. So when the teacher goes back to class, what was striking to me was the absence of rancor, was the absence of the students picking on him, or it didn't seem to be there. It looked like, things are not all normal, of course, because of what has happened. But then one has to carry on with the rest of the year. So it's almost as if the Suleiman issue could not have ended in any other way, and no one seems to be, making it a problem with the teacher alone or any such thing. And one is going on, with the year and with the activities, as it were. So I thought these two said something which was quite different than what one might have expected if something like this had happened in the Indian classroom context. So that was what was quite different for me. Thank you very much.
Yeah, in terms of the rancor, actually, um, we have to realize also that the fact that the students are speaking so much in his class is also a reflection on his teaching abilities. And we are left to guess because a lot of the things are unsaid in the film. But we have to realize, or we have to guess that the students are not speaking so much in the other classes. And so in a way, they accept him as a kind of an equal or a friend, or maybe these are very strong terms. But in a way, the fact that they are debating, the fact that they are arguing with the teacher is a significant step in itself. And which is the kind of which is the reason why at the end, when it's the end of the term, there is no rancor, as you said, because the students, even to start with, once you consider that this is not the first year that he's taught quite a few of those people in his class, because he knows them already and so on. There are references to that in the beginning. For them, he is in a way a friendly figure, because they understand that in his class we have more scope to say, we have more say.
Yeah,
And so
sure.
that
Yeah.
is very much something that the students, I'm sure, appreciate.
They didn't appreciate him for his friendliness, but at the same time, I think those two students who are the class representatives, they behaved in a rather manipulative manner because they go back to the class and report the exact opposite of what
Right,
Francois was trying to do. And
right,
even as far as Francois goes, he does not in the final meeting, where they are deciding about Suleiman. He does not bring up the issue of the fact that he is a gifted photographer, and when given a chance, he can, like blossom. And so he also, I think, reveals himself to be flawed in that sense. And even in the class, I thought he picks on Suleiman more often than he does the other students. And he does also convey to the other faculty that, this child is a problem child, and things of that kind. So I don't think he's entirely blameless as well.
no, no, not at all. In fact, so that is where the construction of the film is interesting. If you realize how, in a way, the conflict at the climax um, is arrived at. So, if you realize the turn of events, the student representatives, like you justly said, uh, with the teachers, he's actually trying to justify Suleiman, but they come back and in the first place during the meeting, they're giggling like stupid girls, which obviously they are not stupid. Um, So that is the first point where he's angry at them for doing what they are doing inside that meeting. But secondly, they misrepresent what he has said about Suleiman, and the fact that he's tried to actually be take his side. So when they misrepresent that, that is where he blows off his lid. And you realize that, and again, this is one thing that I think is lost in translation, but he uses that particular word petas, and so that is definitely his mistake. A teacher should never use that word in class when he's talking to his students. And so he definitely makes a mistake there. And he makes it at a point where he's lost control over himself. So that is the construction of that narrative, which is kind of reaching its climax, not really in the eviction of Suleiman, but in the in Francois' use of the word petas. Actually, he should, I mean, that is like a no-go totally. I mean, he can, if that blows up, he can lose his job. So that is very much the mistake he makes when he loses control. And everything that he has done up till then, it's almost like he's wiped it off, or what his actions have the potential of wiping off everything, every good thing that he's done to try to help the students do something in his class and so on. So in that sense, it's a very cleverly constructed narrative.
Yeah, Tarkeshwar.
I might be wrong in my reading of the film, but those two student representatives in the meeting, uh, when they come back and what they report to other students, I didn't think it as a kind of manipulation or misrepresentation, which is deliberate. Uh, they were expecting him to be more radical, but the way he played in the meeting, he was trying to, yes, agree to certain things about Suleiman and also defending. But these students were not expecting him to even say certain things about Suleiman in that fashion. So for them, they were not expecting other teachers to come to the rescue of Suleiman. They had given up hope, but they had some hope on this teacher. When he also said certain things, that became the point to be highlighted in their reporting to other students. That's how
Right.
I read it. I might be completely wrong,
No, no, no. And
but
which is
it.
which I think which is a fair representation. Yes.
Mm. And the other thing is about the teacher is liberal. He is trying to accommodate their concerns and issues and try to convince them. So, but liberalism also has certain kind of limits. So this is a kind of clash between liberalism and radicalism. You can, until unless his authority is questioned, he is liberal. Once you question his authority, he becomes very conservative. Or you can simply look at it in the context of narrative as a kind of ego, where his authority is questioned. When he says no, it has to be no. When he gives opportunity, you can come. That is the problem with liberalism too. So to that extent, I think uh, he is not able to push the boundaries of liberalism further. So somewhere it draws a line.
Yes, and again here we must. I mean, I have to point something out, and the bone of contention between him and Suleiman is the fact of saying "tu" in French, and again that is untranslatable. So just like we have it in Hindi here, we say "tu" and "tum" and "aap." So the French have "tu" and "vous." So the students have to say woo to the teacher out of respect or whatever. Um, and Suleiman starts talking to him by calling him Tu. And that is the limit that he sets in class, saying that no matter what, you cannot call me Tu. And I think there you cannot blame him, because that is, he has to set limits despite opening the classroom and giving a lot of liberty to the students, there have to be limits that he has to set as a teacher inside the classroom, and that is the limit that he sets in all fairness. The other problem is that he's also bound by the system, in the sense that when all the others are complaining about Suleiman, uh, he has to retain his objectivity, and he cannot go to the other extreme of taking Suleiman's side, because no matter what, it is very well understood by everybody in the staff that Suleiman is a problem. I mean, he is, uh, and this is where I think the film is very well made, that it makes you ask yourself these questions, that it is obvious that Suleiman is constantly trying to um, uh, go beyond his boundaries, and he is provocative. And it's interesting because it's like, if the teacher tolerates something, then he goes and does something more. If the teacher tolerates that much also, then he goes and does something more, until he reaches a point where the teacher has to say, stop, I can't tolerate this. So in that, it's a very cleverly constructed power game between the student and the teacher. And secondly, in terms of his evaluation, it's almost like jury duty, that the student is now um, uh, an accused in the courtroom, and then all the teachers are kind of obliged to be as objective as possible in evaluating him. And that is where even Francois is he's kind of bound by that system, and he has to give his objective evaluation without taking Suleiman's side too much. So in a way, somewhere in one of his interviews, the director, I think he had quoted Jean Renoir from one of his most critically acclaimed film, The Rules of the Game. The Rules of the Game also has a lot of characters, and in which a lot of things happen where you're made to question what is right, what is wrong, and who could have done things differently, and what has where did we go wrong. In a way, it's a film that has its parallels, because it was made just before the Second World War, and in a way, it's also making the French people ask themselves, where did we go wrong? And while France is on the verge of the Second World War, and here again is the same thing, that the film makes you ask questions, or especially if you're a French person, it makes you ask questions. Where did we go wrong in terms of the French Republic? Where did the French Republic go wrong? And so the dialogue that Laurent Conte had repeated from Renoir's film was that everybody has his reasons. So in a way, he's trying to say that in this film also, everyone has his reasons or her reasons for acting the way they do. And finally, it becomes very difficult for us to judge that, this person was wrong, this person was right. And if we are put to jury duty, and if we are made to judge on the personalities or the characters in this film, uh, it becomes very difficult to be objective.
Sanjay, you wanted to say something? Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, actually, this film tries to present both the sides, the teacher sides and the student sides. And if spectators are expecting something like, that finally the teacher will turn out to be a hero who will tame the students, or, or the finally students, they will be able to win the arguments and finally, change the teacher. But nothing of the sort happens, and finally we see that both the sides are represented, and both the sides are strong also, they have their own arguments. Because there are difficult questions and there are no easy answers, so both the sides, they are playing their role and they are raising some questions which are difficult to answer. And that's why we do not get answers within the film. And the film focuses, as it is named, within the walls of the classroom. It doesn't go beyond the classrooms except for the references, certain references in the conversation. The camera doesn't show, except again in the beginning where he's taking a coffee and he enters the premises. So, but the objective is not to, show the outside world, but rather focus in the classroom. That's why the film has been made like that. But there are certain questions which the film raises. For example, the dichotomy between the oral language and the written language. This is something which has been raised since ages. And what happens in this case, that the French is being taught in France, in Paris. Even if students they are from different backgrounds, their parents might have been from a Maghrebian background or African background or Asian background. But finally, they are learning French. And the problem is that the written language is obviously is different from the oral language. That happens in most of the cases. But the more the gap between the written and the oral, the more problems it poses. So what happens, like as in the beginning, the question has been raised over the use of the imparfait of subjunctive, which is imperfect of the subjunctive. And students genuinely, they question that, why should we learn? Because nobody is using it. Okay. But the teacher has a point, he says that it is there in literature. Okay? And the teacher has to teach some literary text. So unless you know that grammar, you will not be able to understand your cultural heritage, your literary heritage. And the same is the case with the passé simple. That passé simple is not taught, like simple past is not normally taught in Indian schools and universities, but is again written French. But again, the problem is also of the hierarchy of the power, because passé simple can be used by somebody, even in spoken, somebody who is in a high authority. The president of France can use passé simple, but I cannot use passé simple. That is also a problem, because so it has to do with the hierarchy. At a certain level, that particular form of language is associated with power, and those people who are in power, they use that kind of language in order to differentiate themselves from the other people. So the kind of language, for example, Suleiman is speaking is perfectly normal for him. Speaking in his locality or in his family, even using the tu form also might be very normal for him. I don't think he is using tu to insult the teacher. That's how he speaks at home. Maybe with his parents also, he uses tu. He doesn't use vous with his parents. Okay, and with his friends in the locality. So that's the kind of language which he has learned and which is important for him. But again, if you look at it from the side of the teacher, that he thinks that that questions the hierarchy. So if you are using tum instead of aap in Hindi, that shows that you consider yourself as equal. So there is a power game also which is inbuilt in the differences in the language, and also the difference between the oral and the written. So there are some writers who try to bridge this gap, like Céline in French literature, that who said that that's the only language which I speak. That's the language I'm going to write in. So he doesn't accept the difference between the written language and the oral language. But again, the problem is not that simple. That you look, for example, something written in dialect, then it becomes literature. So for example, Dante was writing in Tuscan dialect, and that Tuscan dialect itself, because Dante was writing, and that's why he's known as the father of Italian, because that became Italian, the standard language. But it was a dialect, simple dialect, Tuscan dialect. So even that how dialect becomes a language, and you are not allowed to use certain expressions in official setting or in the classroom or when you are writing an official letter. Okay? That also causes disadvantage to the people who have not learned that kind of language because of their background. There is something of the family which also comes to play a role in the classroom. So what kind of language you are speaking? For example, I don't know, there is some kind of blockage where Suleiman is not able to write that in the proper French. So he's trying to present that with the photographs. So, and also the French policy to present as French as the only language, but that's also a myth. There is a linguist, Louis Jean Calvet, who said that there are around 26 languages in France. Okay, people don't talk about them. That's a different thing. But he counts all those languages and whatever may be the number of speakers, but those languages are present. And here we are not distinguishing between the language and the dialect again, because language is nothing but a dialect with an army. Okay, so what happens that how do we tackle those problems? How do we resolve those issues? And it's not easy. So the film doesn't give any easy answers, and that is where we feel this kind of discomfort, and we don't know whether finally the teacher has become successful or not. But I still feel that at the point where he is trying to argue that what happens to Suleiman when he is expelled from school, probably then he is going beyond the four walls of the classroom. And the girl, the student who tells him that, once he is expelled from school, then his father will send him to Africa, to Mali. So what happened? And there are other teachers who are saying that, that is not none of our business. We are teachers. We can't take the role of parents. Okay, what they decide to do with their children. But whatever it may be, still, I think the school is not obliged to find out, after expelling the student, to find out another school. But in this case, at least, I think it is because of the efforts of the professor, French teacher, François Marin, that finally the committee agrees that, the school is also going to help Suleiman to find out some other school where he will get
Sorry,
admission.
just
Yes.
one.
Yes,
sorry
yes.
to interrupt you, but just
Yes,
one
sir.
clarification here. So because schooling is a fundamental right, um, so the state is obliged to find every pupil a different school. And you see the other aspect of that, when Carl, the other student, he comes to this school. So it is left unsaid there, but people who know the system, and so the French people who are watching the film, they'll understand that he comes here because he's expelled from another school, and then it is this school that accepts him. But the way the system works is that if you expel a student from one school, it is the state's responsibility to find him another school. And the only way, in a way, that he can escape is that if his father uh, sends him to Mali, then he escapes this system. But as long as he's in France, it is illegal if the father says that he stays home and he doesn't go to school.
I just
So,
wanted to say something
yeah,
here in this, if
yeah.
Sanjay is finished. Actually, I wanted to bring this question up, this issue up, actually, that, this whole, we're looking at public education here. And that is a very, very important context, because
Yes,
that's like,
yes.
this came up, it is the state's responsibility.
Right.
And that is also another reason why, especially in Western Europe, with the influx of immigrants, when not influx, but when immigrants started coming in the numbers post 90s particularly, the public school system was really shaken, because you suddenly had to accommodate, you believed that it was a normative kind of Christian, white, etc., and you had others, of course, Algerians, Moroccans, had been Tunisians, had been there, but not to the extent to which you do in the African countries introduced. The race and religion came in a very big way, and it was very difficult for the public education system. It wasn't that simple, and what we see are those tensions and struggles, basically. So it is the public education system, and I think one has to keep that in focus. And I think one thing that is there is that we are talking about immigrants, and they are actually supposedly French-speaking immigrants. The French colonial policy, as far as I know, my limited reading of certain colonies, was that the policy was very much trickle down also. So they did actually educate elites in standard French, and the rest were left to their devices. I mean, it was not given importance. So what we have is immigrants coming in who don't belong to the elite groups from these colonies. So they speak a kind of, bad word, but patois, I mean, a kind of, not real French in their thing, which makes it even more difficult for them to teach French, standard French. And I think the real denouement of the whole film comes actually, at least for me, with Suleiman's mother coming into the picture. Because here you have a child who's seen as a problem, who belongs to what Wakant has called the urban outcast community. And then you have, which is also criminalized and stigmatized and everything anyway. And then you have this child who's seen as a problem child in the French class. And then you have a mother who doesn't speak French. So it's this kind of relationship of language, power, the imprints, I mean, of colonialism. I mean, all this, and the colonies coming home, and the kinds of problems that creates. And I think that last bit now with his mother, and it's really what actually, for me at least, really turns the entire thing kind of gets wrapped up. And it's such a candid and honest piece of writing. If the film was as close to the writing as I believe it must have been, it's so honest and candid and self-reflective. I mean, it's amazing, self-reflection on the part of the author. But I think the end is what to me is the most, it kind of really wrapped up the entire film. The fact that, his mother, he's translating for his mother. So what's the big deal? He's learned the French. I mean, they're speaking to him in standard French, and he's translating for his mother. So what does that actually, what does that mean? So the end was really very poignant. I mean, that part was, that scene was very poignant.
Yeah, I was actually hoping that someone would mention Suleiman's mother. I think it's one of the best scenes in the film when she comes, and her whole presence, by just being there and being the way she is and talking the way she does, it shows you the kind of situation that is there, and it's a very realistic situation. And I think even in India we can relate to that when there are so many people who where we can see that these kids, they are the first generation of school going children of these families, and then the kind of difficulties that they face, and what is the future of these children, and how they are going to learn something, and uh, what kind of upward mobility that is, the parents are hoping for a certain kind of upward mobility, um, and how much of that is realistic and what is going to happen. So if we start thinking about all these issues, we realize what the film is doing there.
Also, I think we get a completely different picture of Suleiman, because the mother is saying, he helps me in the kitchen,
Right,
and then
right.
he puts his father when it's needed. So, on the one hand, the school frames him as a problem child, and here you have this other perspective where he appears to be a very sweet and sensitive kid in the family.
Right.
Would anyone else like to add to the discussion?
Yeah, I would like to say a few things about that girl who comes in at the end and says, I've learned nothing. Can we trust her? right? So that's one side of it, because uh, what this teacher has taught her is not the language but democracy, his whole way of behavior. And that's something that at that point of time maybe the student cannot learn that, and it's only after a lot of years, when she grows up and reflects, then she might say that, well, that's what I actually learned from him. Maybe I didn't learn French, but I learned the idea of being democratic, right? So I think that might be interesting. And the question about this white Catholic France and schooling, I think they've had a lot of problems, right? In fact, I know that when I was doing some work on Théâtre des Chardets, I came across material which says that they were extreme secularists, and the Catholic Jesuit schools that were closed down, and a lot of them have come to Madurai in Tamil Nadu, right? Yeah, so that's something that's actually happened, because they banned crosses, they banned all those kind of things, which is something that's very interesting, right? And when we talk about the murder of these people for Islamic representation, etc. When we think about India and the caste system, it's not very long ago. Maybe it's 2010 or 2011, somewhere there. I don't remember the year, where a student in Chennai, 10-year-old, murdered the Hindi teacher, right? Yeah, and my students were very upset and said, look, just let's talk about all this, right? I said, is there a caste angle and the language angle? And we didn't know who the student was. We didn't know who the teacher was on the first day when it came out in the papers. But then after that, it was something to do with caste, because this person was from a reserve category or something of the sort, right? And the whole idea of this being a Hindi teacher was upper caste, and the whole question of language, which Tamil has, right? The whole idea of a Hindi teacher, and that is a kind of a fight that's supposed to have gone back to 2000 years against Aryanization. That's Nilkant Shastri's version. Was yeah. So I think all those issues. It's not that they don't connect with us, right? I think we also face a lot of these issues, especially when we have students from tribal backgrounds, and what we call BC or SC or whatever that is, right? Yeah, and they have a lot of problems, right? For instance, it's one of our mutual friends, Mrinal, who brought it up to me once, and he says, well, you expect a student to do all these things, right? Just remember that the question of sitting privately and studying is not part of his culture, right? So you can't expect somebody to sit down and study, right? You don't even expect that. Your expectations are wrong, and it's totally nuts, right? Yeah. Okay, I'll close with that, right?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for bringing up something that I wanted to mention. What you said about democracy. You realize when you watch the film that the classroom has become like a microcosm of today's France, and what the teacher is trying to do is he's turned the classroom into um, an experiment in democracy in a way, because instead of the teacher coming to the classroom and teaching the students, he is more democratic in the way he talks to the students and in the way he makes the students speak. And in a way, so what you said about Henriette at the end of the term, uh, it becomes very relevant here, because no matter what the students think today about what they have learned in this year or in this classroom or whatever, or in the school or whatever, um, we do see them actually voice themselves inside the classroom in various forms, of course, in various registers and in various degrees. But at the same time, we do know that in a way, thanks to this guy, regardless of the mistakes that he makes, regardless of his loss of control and all kinds of things that arise out of that, but regardless of all that, he's definitely uh, making them hopefully better citizens. or citizens in a more in a deeper sense of the word. And I think that is what the original book and the teacher tried to do in the book when he wrote that, and also what the filmmakers have tried to do.
Thank you.
I, th-
Yeah,
I think the film is problematizing uh, the quote unquote the concept of better citizen. What the teacher is trying to do is a different thing, but the narrative uh, is questioning it. So there is a
Yes,
clash
yes,
between two notions of who is
yes,
a proper French citizen.
yes. But which is the reason why the kind of questions that the film raises become important, because these are the kind of questions that, in a way, the film is trying to say that these are kind of questions that the French Republic should ask itself.
Yeah.
okay. Are there any more comments, questions? Okay. Thank you very much, Abhijeet, for this extended and very wonderful discussion. But before we wrap up today's session, we just have a request, and that is, as you all know, in the month of June, June 2nd to be precise, we will be this Talking Films Online, this online group, will complete 1 year. So we were wondering if we could, do something special to celebrate this completion of a year, and we have had our sessions uninterruptedly for an entire year, which I think is something that is laudable. So some of the things that Nikhila and I discussed was maybe we could have a lecture series on cinema, or we could have a film festival maybe based on genres, like a festival on melodrama or a festival on horror cinema and something like that. Then there was another suggestion about having a college, a quiz on cinema for college students. So these are just, some of the ideas that we were exchanging, and we would welcome more suggestions from those of you present here. If we could just have a short discussion on what could be done.